Okay. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Michal Kořan asked me to moderate the last panel, so I just jumped in and had not a chance to listen to your today's discussion. But I think it doesn't matter because this panel is a little bit different from the rest of the conference. It should provide you not the Czech view on the Czech foreign policy, but the US view on democracy. I don't know whether here or just in a larger area. So I will stay just as a moderator because I cannot give you a US view. That's the first year when, after the Velvet Revolution, when I even did not make it to the United States. So I don't know what is the current US view or what are the American views. Yesterday I was moderating our own conference on TTIP, that's this Transatlantic free trade and investment partnership, and we have invited a gentleman from the US representing a think tank, and he said that he cannot provide the American view, but just an American view. So, but those who has put together this panel and invited the two speakers, I think made an excellent choice. I know both Adrian Basora and Charles Gati since the early 90s, and you know, they were serving for different administrations, or they had a different background. One is more diplomat, the other is more a political scientist and a professor. But certainly, if they have something really in common, that's the renommee and prestige and a long history dealing with the issue of democratization, transitional processes in Central and Eastern Europe. I remember when Adrian Basora was serving as the ambassador in Prague, he was a great supporter of the integration of this country, for example, into the OECD, which was the first organization which has opened the door to the Czech Republic after 1992. It was well before the NATO and the EU enlargement, and it has helped very much to set up or to build certain renommee and prestige of Czech Republic as the country in the heart of Europe, and certainly he deserved a lot of credit. And I remember that time he was, I would call an optimist. The title of this panel, I have the Czech program, so Pokrok and Úpadek, an American or the pohled z USA. So I don't know how to translate. Rise and fall of democracy, rise and falls, or what is?
Progress or regression.
Progress or regression. So 10, 20 years ago, I would expect Adrian Basora give us a bit of amusement or enlightenment regarding the progress. And Charles, he was always very critical about the stage of transformation, in particular in his native country. So, Charles, I would expect a more pessimistic or critical review. Now, when I just was trying to catch up for this conference and studying the past 10 years when we did not see so much often, I'm not sure whether maybe we will have two post-pessimistic reviews, but we'll see. In fact, we have to finish 5 to 5 because Professor Gati leads directly to the airport. So I will not hesitate in inviting the first speaker to the microphone. And according to the program, as well according to the alphabet, it should be Ambassador Adrian Basora. Adrian, as I told you, is the US diplomat, with a great credential on the transition process. Even before the Central European revolutions, he was, for example, serving in Spain in a very interesting era of the defrancization in the second half of the 80s. He was serving in the White House as the advisor for Europe in the time of the real revolution, 1989. Then since 92 to 95, he was the ambassador, as you probably know, in the city of Prague, and could see a lot from the first-hand experience, including the process of dividing Czechoslovakia and the first steps towards the integration. And since that, he has left the diplomatic service, spent, as I remember, almost 10 years working as the president of the Eisenhower Fellowship in Philadelphia, and was responsible for the various exchanges with the people of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And since 2004 or 5, Adrian Basora is responsible for leading or directing the program for the project on democracy, democratic transition, which is part of the Foreign Policy and Research Institute in Philadelphia. And this is a classic for Adrian Basora, working for the institution which deals with the reform assessments in this part of the world, including in-depth analysis both of the successes and the failures in the process of the democratization. So, Adrian, the floor is yours.
And thank you all for being here. It's a real honor and privilege to be back here in Prague with you, 24 years after the Velvet Revolution, and a little more than 21 years after I presented my credentials to President Václav Havel on the last day of his presidency of the Czechoslovak Federation. I've been asked, because of the division of labor, not just optimist-pessimist, but because of the tremendous depth of knowledge of Charles Gati, I've been asked to speak more generally about the state of democracy in the post-communist world, and to put it in the context of American foreign policy. And I know that Charles will focus at least partly more on, in part, more on Central and Eastern Europe per se in specific terms. And I will be speaking from precisely the perspective that Sasha Vondra just gave you. In other words, my 2.5 years at the National Security Council, 1989 to 91. I got there just before the Berlin Wall fell, and was there, well, during the most historic period that I can remember in my lifetime, followed by my 3 years as ambassador here, and then, as Sasha just said, the last 8 years of research and writing. The project is called the Project on Democratic Transitions. My main emphasis, of course, has been on the post-communist world because of the proliferation of countries. We have 29 or 30 countries to follow, but I've tried to take it from the point of view of comparative politics more globally, at least as the intellectual, conceptual foundation for the project. The reason I evoked the euphoria of the Velvet Revolution 24 years ago, but also the beginnings of a crack in the facade of optimism when Czechoslovakia was doomed to split, is that I'm acutely aware of the pessimism, anxiety currently prevailing among many Democrats many lovers of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe and the nearby, in the post-communist region, throughout the region. So here are the main themes that I'd like to cover in the 20 minutes allotted, and I will have to go fast. Our excellent interpreters have a copy of my remarks, so hopefully they will not have too much difficulty keeping up. But I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and, above all, be fair and leave all the time needed for Professor Gati's deep perspective. The three things I want to do is first explain that I do understand and deeply empathize with the concerns and anxieties about the future of democracy that we've talked about much of today and yesterday as well. And indeed, a number of the post-communist states have lost some of their extraordinary democratizing momentum of the 1990s. So they do need to find a second wind. That's as pessimistic as I get, Sasha. My second point is that this should not be surprising, nor should it be excessively discouraging, because historically, most transitions from authoritarianism to democracy have been long, complicated, and difficult, and I include even the most successful transitions. And secondly, because true democracy is worth the struggle, and it is indeed a struggle, and I believe there will be a continuing drive for freedom in the post-communist world strong enough to ultimately win out. My third point is, please do not count America out of the equation. Yes, the U.S. is going through a very difficult period in its own domestic politics and economics, and in restructuring its foreign policy after decades of overstretch, military and financial overstretch. But even as we are retrenching and focusing more on problems in Asia, and I profoundly disagree with the concept that was thrown out earlier, supposedly to be provocative, that America is now entirely absent from Europe, has just disappeared. I see it as the United States focuses more on Asia. The problems, the Europeans and Americans will have greater need of each other rather than less need. Therefore, it's essential that we work together, not just on freedom of the seas in Asia, but also on our own democracies, perfecting them, learning from each other's mistakes, and also those of the nearby transitional states, working on their democracies and their success. So I would like to start place all my comments in by placing the post-communist region, in which we've been focusing entirely for the last 2 days, in the broader context of democracy and authoritarianism in the world as a whole. You see the slide from Freedom in the World. You see the green countries are considered democratic, yellow, at least partially democratic, and the blue, authoritarian. In the next slide, looking at it from a global and historical perspective, you can see progress in democratization over the last 40 years. The red line shows that the absolute number of free countries has grown, but that's with the proliferation of total countries in the world. The blue line shows that how slow and jagged progress, frustratingly slow and jagged progress has been. The percentage of democracies has increased only from 29% in 1972 to 46% currently. So it is perhaps not surprising that, and perhaps even something of an aberration, how quickly in the 1990s communism seemed to recede and democracy seemed to leap ahead. In that perspective, the more recent slowdown should not be quite as surprising as it had been for many. The next slide will show you the percentage of authoritarian countries has diminished from 40% in 1972 to 24% currently. That's very encouraging and heartening. However, the next slide, somewhat more ominously, shows you that the number of what I would call semi-authoritarian countries, they call partly free, has remained very high at 30%, and really not much progress on average, even despite the jagged line jaggedness of the lines. Now let's look at this through an even longer historical perspective of 200 years, through the eyes of the seminal political scientist Samuel Huntington. These are his waves of, in his classic 1991, were the third wave, the waves of democratization over history. He argued that democratic transitions have unfolded in a series of alternating waves. So the white area would be the first positive wave, and then the orange-colored or tan-colored sections show the reverse waves. These have created a pattern of roughly 2 steps back for every 3 steps forward. That is the way history has evolved roughly over 200 years. As you can see in the first slide, as of 1926, many of the countries of Eastern Europe had already experienced a significant level of political democratization, at least based on the minimalist democratic criteria that Huntington used. But some of these same newly free countries were then caught up in the reverse wave of fascism and then communism. So you can see many of the countries that are either represented here today or have been spoken about today. But the next slide, the second part of the Huntington presentation, shows you that many of these same Eastern European countries then were in the forefront of Huntington's third wave of democratization that he dates from the 1970s, but certainly included the early 1989 to 91 period. But the slide also raises a question of whether we have now begun a historic third reverse wave. I'm not as yet convinced that this need be the case, but it could be the case. It also shows, however, the reason I've dipped this far back into history is that it also shows the very great degree of turbulence the slowness and turbulence, and it helps explain the degree of turbulence that you've seen in the post-communist transitions. After the excellent start that many countries had in the 90s, a lot of turbulence in the 2000s and even more recently. And it's particularly not surprising. I mean, economic factors were part of what explained these waves. Given the euro crisis of 2008, 9, and even until now, that's a further troubling factor. So these slides also point up, for me, the fact that the creation and consolidation of a truly viable and durable democracy is a long, complex, and non-linear process. And even the most successful transitions from authoritarianism to democracy cannot be counted in years, but rather in multiple decades. So this brief look back at history also reminds us of one other thing, that there are many, many factors that explain success and failure, both internal and external factors. Many of them have been discussed today and yesterday. But I will try to come back to a few of them. It's a complex, multivariant equation, and I would like to give you I've been asked to give you my perspective on it after 8 years of study, preceded by a practitioner's view of it. So with this introduction, let's look at the post-communist region per se. In the next slide. These data are from Freedom House. Most of you are familiar. I won't go into the details. Their annual Nations in Transit publication. So the green countries represent fully consolidated democracies, and the purple or bluish countries, semi-consolidated democracies. And then this was as of a couple of years ago, the former Yugoslav countries are mostly either semi-consolidated or hybrid on the Freedom House scale. And that scale, as I guess most of you know, includes consolidated democracies, semi-consolidated democracies, in the middle hybrid regimes, and then semi-consolidated authoritarian, and then consolidated authoritarian regimes as you slip downwards towards total authoritarianism. Now, in the next slide, unfortunately, Eastern Europe's considerable progress is put in the global perspective when you see the vastness of Russia and Central Asia. The dark brown or orange countries are fully authoritarian. The medium brown are the hybrid, semi-authoritarian, and the tan countries are like Ukraine, are hybrid. And so it's very clear that as you go further east, the pace of democratization or the pace of regression away from democracy has gotten worse. You can also see let's go on to the other to the next slide, because I would like to just give you a quick sense of where things are. Most of you are familiar, but a quick review for our purposes today of where things are in terms of democratization. So we're starting with the most consolidated democracies, the four front runners. I won't name them; they're on the slide, and you can see them, and you know them. The next slide are the four other countries that have been among considered the front runners of democratization for the last decade or more, with the unfortunate, very rapid slide of Hungary downwards to the point where many are considering that Hungary will be fall back into the semi-consolidated, in other words, very concerning red zone or danger zone. The next slide shows three additional members of the EU, which are only semi-consolidated democracies, and you can see they haven't been doing so well. Croatia, yes, because more of the incentives for in advance of EU membership were in play in these last few years, but once they joined, Romania and Bulgaria have regressed, and that the euro crisis certainly didn't help. The next slide shows both this slide and also the next, please, show you the former Yugoslav countries that at least have the potential for membership, and they also show you that they're at a lower, especially the last two, at a much lower level of preparation for democracy. The next slide shows you the hybrid countries that I referred to earlier in the former Soviet Union, those that I consider, and obviously Freedom House considers, that has having the most promise for democracy, and that I consider it is in those countries absolutely crucial that we succeed in helping the Democrats that are deeply rooted in those countries ultimately win out and consolidate democracy in all three countries. It's crucial, hanging in the balance. The next slide shows the only two other former Soviet republics that are still considered semi-consolidated authoritarian rather than fully consolidated authoritarian countries. The next slide shows you the very sad story of Russia's very rapid decline since late 1990s. And then the next slide is the even sadder story of the most deeply consolidated authoritarian regimes. Now let's go back to the map of Europe and the near part of Europe's near abroad, as I would like to call it. As you can see, the further you move east, the less democracy has flourished since the fall of communism. And even in post-communist Europe, as you move south, there seems to be a similar, although weaker, correlation with less democracy as you move further south, or less well-consolidated democracy. However, as I agree very much with what Minister Schwarzenberg said earlier this afternoon, that the slowness with which democratization has moved eastward and southward is less worrisome because it takes a long time. Less worrisome to me and to him, I think, than the fact that there has been measurable regression in several of the post-communist countries. In other words, going back in the wrong direction, in sharp contrast with the very promising beginnings of the 1990s. So as we saw from the slides, this regression is particularly bad in the case of Russia, but also quite discouraging in the case of Central Asia and the Caucasus, with the exception of Georgia. If we put Belarus, Russia, and Central Asia, and the two Caucasus countries aside, I believe that much of the democratic stagnation or regression in the rest of the post-communist world is remediable, and it's essential that we remedy that. And it can be done if we act promptly and effectively. Since Dr. Gati will be focusing more on Central Europe, I'll focus on the broader and longer-term patterns, at least as I have tried to study them over the last 8 years and reached working hypotheses about them. Based on the extensive scholarship that's available, here I would like to list what I consider the most important factors explaining successful democratic transitions. Obviously, the mix varies from one country to another, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but I think it's useful. Here they are for explaining success, not failure. Direct experience with democracy, or at least partial freedoms, prior to communism. Secondly, extensive exposure to Western societies, or the democratic diffusion effect, and proximity helps in that regard. Third, leaders of high caliber in the early and intermediate stages of transition. I obviously think of President Havel and of Lech Wałęsa and his colleagues in Solidarity. Prior existence of civil society or other independent forms of associational life. Fifth, high educational levels and a substantial middle class, which tend to go together. Sixth, a fair and transparent approach to privatization that disperses ownership widely rather than creating instant oligarchs. Seventh, the history of either prior existence as a state or at least a very strong sense of national identity, as in the case of Poland. And eighth, the absence of ethnic or religious conflicts and related violence. Now, these are pre-existing conditions, not things that we can create, except that the map has shifted greatly eastward. So we have created a new reality for many of these countries that are further east now. Naturally, all the opposite factors of these positive indicators for democratization are what help, in my judgment, help explain the lack of progress as you move further east, or some cases further south. And in the case of countries, energy-rich countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, we can also add the so-called energy curse as a negative factor. But in addition to these 8 specific factors that I've mentioned, I think there's one tremendously important cross-cutting factor, and some of our speakers this afternoon have referred to it very thoughtfully, and that is one thing that I think helps to explain why it's such a long and difficult process, why the waves of democratization have been so long and sometimes gone backwards. That is the stickiness, as American political scientists tend to call it, or the slowness to change, the stickiness of political culture. As many of this morning's panelists suggested, the past 2 decades of post-communism make it clear that it takes a very long time to create a strong and fully pervasive democratic political culture. And certainly the communist countries were left with a lot of residue of the opposite, a very powerful residue of the opposite. But I also stress political cultures, the importance of political culture in understanding these transitions, because I think both American and European promotion of democracy, support for democracy, may have underestimated the slowness to change of that political culture, and thus focused too heavily on the more tangible, easy to identify institutional factors. Of course, it was essential to establish fair electoral procedures, new legal frameworks, the building up of new political parties, of civil society, free media, open markets, etc. But as others have mentioned in the course of these 2 days, formal institutions are not in themselves enough to create a vibrant and truly responsive democracy. For these institutions to operate properly, it's essential that politicians, civil servants, businessmen, the citizenry at large, must also be well steeped in the behavioral norms of democracy. These values must be internalized. So, now let's turn to policy. What are the policy implications of this for Europeans and for Americans? The organizers of this conference asked for an American perspective. I'll give you mine. There's no single American perspective, of course. I'll give you mine. Dr. Gati will give you his. One obvious point for me is that we need to develop programs that are far more effective in inculcating the norms and behaviors that add up to a truly democratic political culture. Obviously, a corollary of what I just said about its importance and its slowness to change. And how can this be done? Well, partly by making far more effective use of the media, of exchange programs, of enhanced human interaction with the West on all levels. And let's keep in mind that, as you can see from the map, the borders have moved eastward. The opportunity for democratic diffusion, to use that shorthand, are now greatly enhanced for countries that were much more insulated in the past. Second thing I would emphasize is, very importantly, we need to do more to help develop the next generation of leaders, of young leaders, of properly motivated and well-informed leaders. And I am so happy to see here today such a very strong contingent of young Czech leaders and young leaders from other countries, some of whom are interns at IIR, etc. You are the future, and we need you. In all sectors of society, not just government. And this is one area that I think, and this is this conference has a lot of think tanks and universities, not only governmental representation, and business and media are present. This is one area where think tanks, NGOs, and universities can make a particularly important difference going forward and learning from the lessons of the past. Finally, I would urge that Europeans not count the United States out of the democratization effort in post-communist Europe or Eurasia, notwithstanding Washington's gridlock, notwithstanding our other recent problems, perhaps even because we've shown ourselves to be such a poor model democracy, at least in the short term, and you can learn more. I always used to tell all new incoming classes of Eisenhower Fellows who were, in fact, emerging leaders from Czechoslovakia and from countries all over the world, not just Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union, that you were here, that they were in the States for 2 months to learn from our mistakes as much as from our successes. So don't count us out, and do encourage us to work with you. I think we can still add something, hopefully. Yes, it is true that the United States is worried, Americans are worried about China, and we will be very likely to invest more resources in Asia than we have in the past. But these Asian issues that worry Americans should also be of serious concern to European democracies. You need us, and we need you, if we are to maintain an effective counterweight to China. I know you worry a lot about Russia. I worry about China, and Russia is, to the extent that Russia is a threat, it may have to do with potential alliances or strengthening alliances with Beijing. We need to maintain, you cannot, without a very large and free Europe and a strong transatlantic relationship, maintain a proper counterweight to China and its avowedly anti-democratic model. So this U.S. Focus on Asia should not be seen as a pivot. A pivot implies you turn your back on people. It is not a pivot away from Europe, but rather as an opportunity for Europe and the United States to work together more closely, and a need to work together more closely. And not only for freedom of the seas in Asia, but for the nurturing of democracy globally. Unless we enlarge our community of democracies, the geopolitical balance will ultimately turn against us. Let's not forget that the United States and Canada plus the 500 million people of the European Union are still not more than 850 million people, 2/3 the population of China. And if you add into that or multiply into that the growth rates, economic and military, of China, you see something of the equation. It would be a sad outcome indeed if we fail to stop the emergence of a new reverse wave, of a third reverse wave of post-communist regression, a third wave of regression of democracy in the post-communist region, which until 2004, till just a decade ago, was the beacon of successful democratic transition worldwide. We cannot let that trend reverse. Let me conclude by coming back to my 3 initial points very quickly. First, yes, some of the post-communist states have indeed lost their exceptional democratizing momentum of the 1990s. So it is essential that we help them find their second wind. Second, we must nevertheless have patience or understanding of the stickiness of political culture and therefore maintain a long-term commitment to this democratization effort, keeping in mind the fact that most transitions to democracy have been long, complicated, and difficult, as I've tried to document, but that true democracy is worth the continuing struggle. And finally, as I said, don't count America out of the equation. Instead, please continue to work with us and encourage Americans from all sectors. And Europeans tend to think more of government because government plays a larger role, relatively speaking. Americans from foundations, universities, the media, and the business world, and work with all Americans, encourage them to stay involved. Yes, we have, as a nation, a little bit of a short attention span. You can get our attention by positive courtship towards partnership, rather than simply expecting, oh, you must love us because we're who we are, but rather because you can offer partnership, as you have in Afghanistan, for example, and in many other ways. But perhaps more of that will be needed as we feel maybe more burdens from the overstretch of the last couple of decades. And it's very particularly important, my final point in this regard of partnering with Americans, or Americans wanting to partner with you, it is essential that we partner with those countries your countries, the post-communist countries, whose transitions to democracy are recent and whose memories of the alternative are still alive. To succeed, we need you, and hopefully you will still find some value in working with us. Thank you.
So thank you very, very much. It was not a pessimistic, it was a realistic with some optimistic outcome. Well, the second review of where we are is up to Professor Charles Gati, a man who has the real credential too. More as a professor, as a man of writing than the man of diplomacy. So it means that sometimes he's more straightforward. He's not bounded as the classic diplomat usually is. Charles has certainly a personal experience. He's a Hungarian who has fled the country in 1956 when this first serious attempt to free from the communist oppression has failed. In fact, the attempt, which was to a certain extent also provoked by the United States and the people in Budapest has believed what Radio Free Europe has broadcasted, and then the Russians came and nobody was willing to help them, which is in fact a theme of the book which you have written earlier under the title Failed Illusions. Charles Gati is a professor of the European Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington. He was teaching in the past with the Union College, with the Columbia University. He has also had a brief intermission working for the government. It was sometimes early in the 90s where he served as the advisor to the policy planners in Department of States. But mostly he's known for his books. The last one was presented here yesterday, I guess, his critical autobiography, or rather critical biography, or rather the assessment of the work of one of the giants of the American Cold War and post-Cold War diplomacy, and foreign policy thinking. I mean, speak Brzezinski. I was not here yesterday, but I'm gladly waiting for the book after the end of this panel. So I remember we had a lot of talks about the Hungarians, and especially about the Hungarian government under the Fidesz leadership, because, you know, the roots were somehow common. I remember in the summer of 1989 that the group of young Fidesz guys who were, I guess, younger than you are here today, were visiting Prague. Prague was still under the hardline communist leadership, while Hungary at that time was already semi-free country, so they could travel, they could start their activism in the official Hungarian policy. So they visiting Prague, young Viktor, young András Hegedűs and others. They were sleeping in my apartment because they were so young that they were trying to save the money and did not go to the hotel. And that was the time of the euphoria where we were following, let's say, the same path and had a very similar or the same views. So, Charles, 25 years after, where we are now.
Thank you very much. I'm almost inclined now to talk about the old days, but that's not why I was brought here to speak. It's an honor to be on the same panel here with Sasha Vondra, an old friend, and I think very importantly, a great friend of the United States. And I say this obviously for myself, but I know that everybody who in Washington or elsewhere knows anything about the Czech Republic and about the United States, they know how much he has done in official and unofficial capacities over many, many years. And so I'm very pleased to be here with you. I'm also pleased to share the podium here with Ambassador Basora, with whom, my views actually, despite this discussion here about optimism and pessimism, I think actually we share most views, certainly most information. He has, and in the early 1990s, I can reveal that he and I conspired even, because I know that in this part of the world you have to have a conspiracy theory. So here it is. He was ambassador here and in Prague, and I was on the policy planning staff in the Department of State pushing for NATO enlargement, and he knew that. But officially, the U.S. was not yet. This is 1993, maybe early 94. The U.S. was moving a little slowly, and so at the State Department, I did not have a secret telephone, so he had to call me in another bureau at the Department of State where my wife worked, because she was an assistant secretary and she did have a phone, and so we could then assume that nobody was listening, though I'm no longer so sure after what I hear about the National Security Agency, or for that matter, all other agencies that probably listen. In any case, it wasn't that big a conspiracy. We were just crying on each other's shoulders about the slow tempo of moving ahead with NATO enlargement, but it was great actually for me to be here in January of 1994, when at long last, the President of the United States said that the issue is no longer whether, but when and how. And I'm sure, Sasha, you remember that very well, and Ambassador Basora, that was a big step. And some of us who were writing some of those speeches and I was here actually with a great Czechoslovak, I would have to say, then Ambassador Albright, and then we also took a visit to 11 countries. I went with her, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, etc., to spread the news that that NATO enlargement was going to happen, but just please be patient. And I'll never forget the encounter we had with Lech Walesa, who did not want to believe us, actually. But in the end, I think the United States did deliver. Anyway, I don't want to go into, I could go on, and Mr. Vondra made me think of the old days. Yes, I also had Mr. Orban not quite sleep in my house, but he certainly spent days and days in New York City, actually, and I went with him also in 1994 on a campaign trip, just the two of us. And that would be another story to tell, but let's do that another time. Times have changed, and now we are not on speaking terms, and I'm a critic of the Hungarian government, and I guess you all set me up here to voice that criticism, and I'd be very happy to do that. I will try to speak slowly so that you could more easily understand me. I remember when I was an immigrant in the United States many decades ago, and I did not speak English, and this was at Indiana University, and after some of my new friends there being very sympathetic to my problems with the English language, they started to shout at me, thinking that I was deaf, and I had to tell them I am not deaf, but speak slowly, then I might have a chance to understand what you're saying, because I did know some, but certainly was not enough. So I am not going to shout. I am going to try to speak, though, slowly. I will take up a few minutes of my time here before I do talk about Central Europe to ask the question that I think is not being asked here at this conference, and I don't know if maybe somewhere else in the Czech Republic it is asked. I know it is asked in Poland, and I know it is asked in Hungary. Those are the two countries I know better than I know the Czech Republic, and that is, does America have the right to talk about democracy and democratization, given the extraordinary problems that we have experienced in this century? I know you know all of this well, but we have had the problems and cruelty in Iraq. We have had Guantanamo. We have had more recently, and I'm jumping over lots of things, the immense problems in the US Congress passing a budget, not exactly a sign of a vibrant democracy. We have a debt crisis, the inability of the two parties to come to terms on how to proceed. We have a Tea Party that likes East European conspiracy theories very much. At times I wonder where it comes from, and that's my conspiracy theory, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to ask the question, do we have the right even to preach, to lecture, to talk about democracy? Well, I'd like to think that we do, because I don't think these problems are permanent in the United States. I am very much an optimist, by the way, Sasha, on this issue. I have to tell you that. I think the United States will bounce back. I'd like to mention to you all previous occasions when people wrote off the United States. Just in your measure, it's a very young audience. Thank God, I love that. But even you may have read back in the 1980s, it was all Japan. Japan was taking over the world maybe, but certainly economically. Where is the United States? Now it is mainly China that I read about, that tomorrow or the next year or 10 years from now, there will be no American economic primacy, but it will be all China. I don't believe this for 1 second, by the way. The flexibility of the United States, the ability to bounce back, a very good term that I use, is really such that that I think we will continue to do well. And I think in the political realm too, I see changes in the, we're not going to go into details, in the Republican Party. that promise to make it possible for somebody like me, who most of my life I voted for the Democratic Party, but not always. I used to, when I lived in New York, there was a Republican Party there with Rockefeller and Javits and others, and I was able to support them. And I look forward to the time when I have a choice, and I think that time will come. But it's not just the future. Already, I think, if you take a look at some important economic and cultural indicators, don't write off the United States. I very much agree with Ambassador Basora. Economically, 2/3 of the world's GDP is now produced by the West, meaning Europe and the United States. Now that's a lot, 2/3, 68% or whatever. The others don't even come close, nor do I expect them to get much closer. But life is not just economics. Life is culture. American universities, for example, I do have a stake in that. I realize I'm not totally unbiased here. But whatever list you look at, and so I decided in preparation for this to look at non-American evaluation of universities in the world. So here is one by some institute in Shanghai. Okay, not an American institute, not a European institute, and so they listed universities. Well, the first 9 are American. 10th is Oxford. Then again, it is various Western universities, and actually American universities. And the 20th is a Swiss Institute of Technology. My students, by the way, about 35% come from abroad to America and pay those horrendous tuitions that we charge at American universities, but they find a way, particularly from Asia. I don't have to tell you, I didn't have a chance to take a walk here in Prague, but I have done this in other cities over the years. But I would bet my last koruna that, maybe not my dollars, but that most of the movies that you see downtown here are American movies. Certainly on television, everywhere I go. It's not so good, but still Americans. It's American English. You all speak American English. Maybe I heard one person here speak with a sort of British accent. It's American English that's everywhere in the world. This cannot be reversed. In sports, now I'm not going to talk about hockey, but in other sports, because I do defer to your expertise on this, or the Hungarians, water polo, and so on. But in most other sports, Americans do exceptionally well. And I could go on, even symphony orchestras. Now, you would think that this is something for somebody else. Now, it is true that European orchestras are ahead. But in the top 20, well, first of all, they're all Western, okay? And I say this because Mr. Orban in Hungary talks about the decline of the West and the decline of this and the decline. I don't know who is coming up, but his nationalistic fervor, and he's not the only one. Kaczynski says pretty much the same thing in Poland, and there are lots of people like that in Romania and elsewhere as well. But even in symphony orchestras, number 19 is a Japanese orchestra, and I am very pleased to say that the Prague Symphony is there in the top 20, and so is the Budapest Symphony Orchestra. In short, don't sell. I agree with Ambassador Basora. Don't sell the United States or the West. That we are the wave of the future. We are the wave. We have a pretty good past too, but we're still there. We have problems, political deadlock. We have European integration is slow, although Croatia is in, but this is huge problems. Brussels bureaucracy, you can go on. You have heard this from President Klaus, certainly for too many years, how awful Brussels is. Some people compare Brussels to Moscow, which of course is an outrage in my opinion, because no country in this part of the world joined the Comecon voluntarily, or whatever it was called, or SEMA by abbreviation, or the Warsaw Pact, and, but you did decide to join NATO and the European Union. They're not perfect. But you know, aside from you all and us on this podium, nobody else, or my wife, nobody else is really quite perfect. So I would say I am very much an optimist. Now about Central and Eastern Europe. Now you have the Freedom House survey and other very important comments that made by Ambassador Basora. And from that you see that, that there are now 8 countries judged by Freedom House to be consolidated democracies, including the Czech Republic, very importantly. But you also see that some of them have declined in ratings in the last 10 years. Poland is one, and Hungary is the most ominous and most important decline, and it is indeed very close to jumping and being in the next category of semi-constitutional democracies. That may or may not happen. So it's very difficult to generalize about the 10 countries. Some of them are doing well. I do think the Czech Republic is doing well. So you have the problems of democracy, which is, you know, I'm not going to go into this. So right now you don't have a government, but it seems that, you know, you're doing okay without some countries do well without a government, and maybe even better without a government than having a bad government. So look at it, you know, positive. It's not the end of the world that you have a crisis, and moreover, the important thing is the circumstances under which the Prime Minister had to resign. You know what? I know my view is probably I'm by myself with this and nobody else. I like that very much. He was caught, and his chief of staff was caught. They used the intelligence service to find out who was doing what under, you know, in the bed or elsewhere. And as a result, well, I think Mrs. or Ms. Nagyova is history, and the Prime Minister is gone. And you know what? It is unique, actually, in Central and Eastern Europe. It is unique, because elsewhere, it's only the other side's doings that are being questioned and punished. But here you have a Prime Minister in office who is forced to resign. Yes, it is corruption of some sort, but there's punishment, which there should be. It's good, be proud of this. No, I know you don't like the current situation in between governments, who is going to do this and that, and will the 3 parties really get together? I don't know, I don't have an opinion on this, but I think Czech democracy is doing well. So it is very difficult to generalize here about the condition of democracies. And so some of my list applies to the Czech democracy, others apply elsewhere, but here is a list of why you're not doing better, you meaning Central and Eastern Europe, why not doing better than we had expected in the heroic age of the 1990s, when we did think that things would be easier than they have turned out to be. The first point that I would make is corruption. Corruption is there everywhere, and more so than elsewhere. Transparency International is very good on this topic. It is worth studying. And in addition to the usual things discussed about corruption, primarily it's greed, I would mention 2 things. One is that the laws enacted, laws and regulations are not yet very good and are not always implemented. The other one is something that you might not have thought of, and that is that the region's politicians have no other skills but being politicians, which is to say they came into this business of politics in the 1990s. Many of them are still there, and they never did anything else. So therefore, knowing in advance that the day of reckoning will come, which is to say the day when they have to leave office, they have to put some money on the side for themselves and for their children, because they don't know how to make a living. It's kind of sad, but it's understandable. It's not good. I don't mean it approvingly. What I'm saying is it's different from the outside world. Let's say in the United States, when a lawyer or a businessman could go back, or a professor like me, I could go to the government, and then after that I go back and do what I actually do a lot better than being, in the State Department, being an academic. I could do that. So think of corruption this way, and it will come to an end, or will be less. There will always be corruption. There is in every society. A second reason why things are not going better than they are has to do with what I call democratic fatigue. I think people are a little tired of the big words and the high expectations. You know, back in 1989, when I was here in Prague, and I was in Warsaw as well, the expectations were huge, the enthusiasm huge. In part, the United States is responsible for this, because we kept saying through Radio Free Europe, aside from broadcasting Jakashi's very funny speech. Some of you may have read about it or listened to it at the time. But we kept saying, throw out the commies and the good life will follow. And that has not happened. I think we misled the people, and I think there is a reaction to that. And there is also in democracies a kind of dissonance that many people don't like. Too much noise, too many arguments. The struggle for power in the communist world that some of you had experienced was behind closed doors. You didn't know how awful these people were to each other. Now you do. Now you see that they are really out for selfish reasons very often. Not only that, but you have that as well. And so I think fatigue here with noise, with dissonance, with disappointments, I think plays a role here. A third reason why I think things are not going so well is part of political culture that Ambassador Basora mentioned, and that has to do with minorities. But here in the Czech Republic, the issue is the Romas. But elsewhere, you have serious issues. In Slovakia, you have a problem with the Hungarian minority. Same in Romania. Incredibly, Polish-Lithuanian relations are not as good as they should be, even though Lithuania would not be in NATO had it not been for Polish support. But the Lithuanians have a view of Polish street names, among others, that frankly boggles the mind. They have difficulties, they have problems. Then in several countries, you have a problem of anti-Semitism. So I could go on in many others. Of course, in Bulgaria, you have the Turkish issue. You always have had that. Bulgaria is a very unstable country now. Keep your eye on it. And so I think the elites here have a responsibility to educate the public about the benefits of diversity. Yesterday, I spoke about this extensively, about Brzezinski and Kissinger paving the way for a new generation of foreigners, immigrants, women, blacks, Jews, into the foreign policy community of the United States. 50 years ago or 40 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to have a Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State, or a Condoleezza Rice as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. The benefits of diversity, for the United States, I believe, are huge. And I don't think that proper education in this part of the world has done enough to embrace this very important value. Polarization is another factor, I think more in Poland probably than anywhere else. And the style of politics is really very different from the West still in many of the EU 10 countries. By polarization, I mean the atmospherics of politics, that people who are your adversaries are regarded as enemies. There was a very interesting display here today. But I was told, and the panel got along rather nicely, and I said to myself, now, isn't this wonderful? It couldn't happen in Poland or Hungary. But then I was told that some groups or parties were either not invited, like the Communist Party, or one of them did not show up, or didn't come, or couldn't be reached, and that in reality there is much more tension among, and then maybe even name-calling every now and then. But believe me, it's worse in Slovakia. You probably know that better. It is far worse today in Hungary. I mean, even an outside critic like myself, the kinds of language they use against me these days is really, enemies. Together with George Soros and Hillary Clinton, I'm probably, one other guy, I'm probably in the top 4 enemies of the state. I'm not a critic of the government. I'm an enemy of the state. Now that is right-wing Bolshevism, if you know what I mean. That would require more explanations. Now finally, I'll say a word about the political culture. I already sort of touched on this. Conspiracy theories are more present here than in most Western cultures, and they have not yet been fought. They vary. Conspiracy theories is, the Russians are behind everything. In some cases, of course, there's an element of truth to that. Elsewhere, you hear that it's foreign banks, international bankers, or even cosmopolitans, which, of course, has a particular ring to it. Certain foreign enemies who think of nothing else but to do in a poor little country somewhere. My wish, sitting in Washington and being concerned about Central and Eastern Europe and caring about Central and Eastern Europe, I wish, as Ambassador Basora would, I know, is that we would spend more time and more energy on Central and Eastern Europe. But the critics say that we are conspiring to undo the results. On the contrary, the problem is negligence rather than anything else. Okay, my time is up. I will say nothing very profound about US policy or Western policies. I think it's the EU and NATO through which we can be effective, and I think they're doing an okay job, maybe not great, and one can be critical. Aside from that, I would only say that, this is not a view that's widely shared, is that security issues were very important in the 1990s, and for the 3 Baltic countries, military security remains important because you never know what Russia might do. But for the other 7 countries in the EU, now 11 with Croatia, I think the issues that Washington and Brussels and others should concentrate are not military security. They have to do with democracy, they have to do with trade issues, they have to do with perhaps education and so on. But above all, example. The United States has not done very well in this respect, and I think as soon as we put our own house in order, I think democracy will continue to grow, and the next phase that Ambassador Basora cited and Huntington writes about, the next phase will be as beautiful as the 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I like your optimism about the ability of America and Western culture and civilization to survive and to stay in offensive. That's important because there is too much defensive, I think, after 2008 among the Westerners. You mentioned China. It's jak se řekne kouzlo nechtěného anglicky. How to say, bizarre ship of unwanted, or there's a Czech proverb, kouzlo nechtěného, is a bizarre ship of unwanted. In the castle, there is a big conference on China. I don't know whether you know that. Idealists like Basora, Gati, Vondra, Surprisingly, Jirka Schneider, not surprisingly, Petr Kipr are here, but the big players are there discussing China, you know, right today. And I think minister is there, isn't he? Yeah, okay. So you see, this is the Czech double-track approach. You know, here we are discussing democracy, and then they are discussing with the business with China under the auspices of the president and the Chamber of Commerce. The question, you know, whether the American has a right to say or right to preach, right to lecture. You are here, so we have the opinion that certainly you have the right to say. If I may open this with a question, you know, because try to respond quickly, you know. What is the most successful example of American engagement in transitional process in the last 100 years, anywhere or in Europe? In Europe, what is the most successful example of American preaching, lecturing, advising, even dictating the rules of the game towards democracy and freedom?
Germany and Japan.
Yes, if you go back that far, I agree. Germany and Japan, particularly Germany, are extraordinary success stories, but that was an unreplicable form of history. I mean, the idea of an occupation for several years and in fact, creating their constitution. And more relevant to our discussion of today's world is, I would say, the big success story. The most important single success story is Poland. Not because we preached to Poland. I think that's a mistake. I have not requested, nor would I ask you ever to offer the opportunity for Americans to preach to you about democracy. What we did say is, in the Roundtable Agreement, when Jaruzelski and Solidarity reached the Roundtable Agreements, what we did say, I was at the White House helping draft the speech that President Bush said, we will support you if you have free elections to the Polish parliament, for 1/3 of the Polish parliament in June of 1989. We will support you at the World Bank, at the IMF. We will mobilize all our, the G7, the group of 7, it was then only 7, all of our Western and capitalist allies, including the Japanese, the Australians, etc., to support your very, at that time, Poland's economy was in terrible shape. Yes, we also created, I helped design the Polish Stabilization Fund to permit the partial convertibility of the zloty as a beginning to get market signals into an economy. I invented, or helped invent, the idea of a Polish-American Polish-American investment fund, or private equity, basically an equity fund, to help jumpstart small businesses or spin-offs from state enterprises. And we did encourage them we did strongly encourage Balcerowicz and his plan. Some people called it shock therapy at the time. It was, given past problems in Poland with inflation and a bad balance of trade problems, yes, we did give them some advice, but we didn't preach to them. We said, we think you're on the right path and we will help you, because we saw that there were the real foundations of democracy, the real local demand, and there were some very smart and dedicated people wanting to make that transition to a market economy and the pluralism and democracy simultaneously. So I see that as a big success story, but not as a story of preaching. Thank you.
Well, when I was putting this question, I was expecting this kind of answer, but Adrian has very smartly escaped this with the Polish story, which is very interesting, and you had made very good points, in fact, but just to give you a right to explain this, why Germany? Let's Japan take aside, of course. Why Germany?
It was I tried to be clever with the answer, and admitting my sin here. I will cite without name a very, very high level now deceased friend of mine in the Pentagon. And we were talking about democratization, or at least the promotion of, as Mr. Schwarzenberg correctly said today, the promotion of human rights in Russia, a cause in which I strongly believe. And so we were just having, a discussion. And this man said to me, he said, you know how we could have human rights and maybe some democracy in Russia? And I said, yeah, I'd like to know. He says, occupy them, occupy. And that's when, Germany and Japan come to mind. Well, the United States did occupy Germany, and I think the result is good. We did a very, very good job at this. Now, elsewhere, what you are trying to get me to say something elsewhere. And I think my answer will be this. One is that the elites have to want to have democracy. It will, in my judgment at least, it will not come from the masses. It will come initially, there will be demonstrations. Wenceslav Square will be full of people, or in Egypt, in Cairo, you will have this. But in the end, democracy must be built by elites, and they have to be united behind the very idea, not the details, but the idea of democracy. I do believe that Czech elites are united in their desire to build a Western-style democracy in the Czech Republic. I would not say the same thing about every other country in the region, but I think that's number one and number two. Then, then the US or others can help. I think the second thing that is essential is the way I ended my little presentation here. The United States and the West must do better themselves to hold up as an example, because our example is what transpired so many democratic experiments in the world. The United States, with all its faults, and I could go back, it's not just now, I mean, it's McCarthyism. And after I went to the United States, I experienced it as a college teacher. I knew what it was like. Don't think that our problems are in 2013 or 2005. We've had periods of the depression and the inability of the United States to get out of the depression. And still, despite all that, so many people in the world, should I say most people in the world, look to the West as the example. If we don't do well, and I think we have a period now when we have not been doing so well, then democratization slows down or reversed. It can be reversed. I think when we do well, when there is a new trade agreement between Europe and the United States, when American foreign policy is more effective than it has been, and I could go on, when there is more justice in the United States. I mean, the Gini coefficient, if you know what I'm talking about, inequality in the United States, I think is not an example that other people in the world would want to follow. It is atrocious, and it has gotten far, far worse in recent decades. In other words, if we do well, and if the local elites in other countries unite behind the ideas and ideals of Western-style democracy, then I think the process will continue and deepen.
Oh, thank you very much. In fact, look, why I asked, I was expecting Germany, and that's the reason why I asked the question. The response is obvious because, look, the Czechs, Poles, it's just one generation, which has passed since 1989. And historically, it's nothing, but in case of Germany, it's already 3 generations. So they have proved that here is the result without any doubt. Even now, in the time of this Western economic crisis, how they are walking through this without, harming their democratic credential, contrary to some other well-established democracy in the West. So let's say it was excellent work. And what I was, what I had in mind, and that's, a small recommendation, where this American preaching or advising should be concentrated in. Not into occupation, of course. It's easier if you are occupying to implement, but it was short, of course, occupation, so it does not guarantee anything. But basically what is at stake, there are two traditions of the, let's say, the revolutions in favor of democratization or more freedom. That's the example of the French Revolution and the example of the American Revolution. The first one was a failure, ending in a massacre. The second one is a success. And what is the difference? Because, look, it's inevitable that after this wave of euphoria, is coming the moment of questions, doubts, regression. So that was this Huntingtonian, or there is also the Zakaria correction of Fukuyama's optimism. And this is exactly this American tradition, how to handle this. This is this Hamiltonian medicine tradition about balancing the power. And that's exactly what you did in Germany, and what is, I deeply believed, a source of the German quality of democracy and stability. That's the balance of power. So here, this is something what you should, in my eyes, preach across not just Europe, but at least all those countries who are praying to democracy and then somehow trying to practicize this. Because, and it's more important than, for example, to change the elite. Yes, in American executive, the people are changing. They are not the long-life politicians, but in the Congress, many of them are long-life politicians. But because here you could be very similar to, there was, for example, one guy who was campaigning in the elections that, you have to go home, all those, you are doing this badly in the last 20, 30 years. Doing something like Ross Perot, doing something like Bidzina Ivanishvili, I have the doubts. There are those who are preaching, direct democracy, referendum every day, praying to Switzerland, but, you have the doubts whether this will lead us to Switzerland or rather to Georgia or even to Kazakhstan. So here, I'm deeply convinced that the American contribution should be the spreading of this Hamiltonian know-how. Questions, please.
Okay, I might have a question. Michal Kořan from the Institute of International Relations, and thank you very much for excellent contribution and for an excellent chairing of the panel. My question would be, in the morning panel, in the second panel, we were discussing the lack of interest in among the Czech public in in the outer world in general, but in democratization in particular. And it was set in kind of a critical note, not only in an empirical and analytical note. It was set in rather critical note that the media should do something about it, that the Czech public is not interested. But my question would be, where is the American public in this? Well, let's say foreign affairs in general and support for democracy abroad in particular, both of them, because both of them are very low among the Czech public. But I would like to know, where is the US public standing in these very days and weeks?
Interest in foreign affairs outside the Middle East and China in the United States has declined. I think there is a kind of general interest in Europe, And the trade agreement that Obama has proposed is one sign of that, and I think there will be support for that. Eventually, over several years probably it will take. Within this broad framework, democratization is probably not a high priority among the American public as such. But then this issue has been, well, more or less an elite issue, I think, over the years anyway. But, and you will understand this, the American public, after the unnecessary war in Iraq and the unwinnable war in Afghanistan, I think is very tired of democratization, because both of those issues, mistakenly, but in the great American tradition, were called as part of the process of promoting democracy. I don't believe they were. Whatever the real cause of Iraq, which I never understood, I do understand the causes in Afghanistan, but they had little to do with democracy. I mean, after all, I mean, is there anybody, a serious person, who can believe that democracy can take root in Afghanistan? It's not taking root in Romania. In Afghanistan? I mean, you have to be kidding. Western-style democracy there? You have to be kidding. I can't imagine that anybody seriously thought that this was possible. But it was being sold that way. It was being promoted that way. The president has, or presidents perhaps, have spoken about it that way. So therefore they discredited the idea of promoting democracy where it would fall on fertile soil. Fertile soil. It has to be there. You cannot transplant democracy, because democracy is not just institutions, it's a frame of mind. It's tolerance. In Afghanistan? So, you know, even I step back. If this is what democracy promotion is about, forget it. But I have to tell you that I was skeptical about for example, NATO enlargement. You may be surprised to hear, to extend to Romania and Bulgaria, because I didn't think that the political culture there would be sufficiently receptive to the cooperation and the spirit of tolerance that that organization would require, among many other qualities. So my answer is the public is in a current mood of reluctance, which doesn't mean that a different president or some circumstance could not reshape it. America is a country of constant change. You know, I have taught this for so many years, I'm tired of repeating it for myself, but you may not have heard it. Most countries in the world, continuity and stability is the normal thing. Most countries in the world. In America, change is the normal thing. That is the default in computer language. Change is default. So, you know, America could surprise you.
Let me just add a slightly more optimistic note. We certainly are not going to go on any democratic crusades, and particularly not a crusade backed by military force and occupying country X, Y, or Z, such as we did after World War II. You can think of the withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan as perhaps a mini Vietnam. In that sense, I agree with everything that Dr. Gati has said. However, the American and most Americans are not very interested in foreign policy, let alone promotion, active promotion, or militant, and particularly not military promotion of democracy. I agree with all of that. But Americans are deeply, deeply committed to the concept of democracy. They believe, despite all the problems and their frustrations with Washington now, that democracy is indeed the least bad of all the forms of government. And you know, and they're also very global, even though they don't think of themselves as being interested in foreign policy. They do travel, they do see what's going on elsewhere. The support at American universities, at American private foundations, and even the support in Congress for continuing to fund the National Endowment for Democracy and other mechanisms where we give at least some support where there is fertile soil. I agree with Charles that if the soil is infertile, Americans are not going to be anxious to go there and force democracy for a long, long time. But where there is fertile soil, as I believe there still is in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and some of the former Yugoslav countries, and hopefully elsewhere, I think we will be there. But we will be there particularly if you, the Europeans, if we see that we have partners. If you know, people, I do think Americans, yes, they're fascinated or concerned about China. I don't think they've forgotten the Transatlantic Alliance. If you had not asked in terms of one country, Sasha, what our greatest success was, it would have been the Marshall Plan. You know, because the point is that when Americans see a need, and a need of people who are like-minded and want to achieve the same values that they live by, the Americans live by, I think there will be support for it. Obviously, we need good leaders to explain the reason, but it will happen. I would be optimistic on that front. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yes, I see you.
Hello, my name is Vít Beneš. I'm from the Institute of International Relations. Professor Gati started his presentation questioning the right of America to preach democracy or to democratize other countries. What do you think about Europe? Does Europe has a right to teach democracy, to spread democracy? Is Europe ready to be a partner in spreading democracy? And can Europe serve as the city on a hill in terms of democracy? You have mentioned the problems with the budget in the US, with the crisis, how to repay the US debts. But just have a look at Europe, the undecision on how to deal with the Euro crisis. Americans in the 1990s were very strong in supporting a united Europe. We no longer have a united Europe. We have a Europe that is divided increasingly, institutionally and legally, into Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries. We have a problem with possible British exit. We have no longer Germans caring about Czech Republic sliding out of the core of the Eurozone. We have huge discussions about a democratic deficit on the European level. We have discussions about failed states in European Union. Many people speak about Italy or Greece as failed states.
6 minutes to go, so you have
I'm
the question, please.
I'm just questioning the state of democracy in European states and in EU.
Please, be for the first.
Thank you. Just one tiny correction. I did not question the right of America to get engaged in or continue to be engaged in democracy promotion. I was wondering, rather, whether others outside the United States might not question the right of the United States. That's a rather important difference. No, I don't have any doubts on that score. Now, as the brief answer to your question is, which some of you may not like to hear, is that the time now, I think, is to deepen existing democracies, those that Freedom House puts in the first or second categories, rather than to seek new targets for this, because I'm very skeptical about the ability. I mean, after all, there's a huge setbacks in Latin America, for example, for democracy. It's very difficult for me to imagine that, you know, to use an extreme example, that the Central Asian countries, you know, even Kyrgyzstan, which is the best of the five, would embrace democracy. I'm I know we have programs, National Democratic Institute, etc. One of my students is involved there. I have to tell you, I am skeptical about it. I think it's far more important to strengthen democracies where they have begun to take root.
Let me say, you phrased the question, does Europe or do Europeans have the right to, I don't like the word preach at all, but do they have the right to suggest or be supportive of democracy? Do they have good models to show to other people? My answer is yes. You have some of the most vibrant democracies in the world on this continent, and they should be showcased. And the programs that you have of support, and this I may disagree a little bit with Dr. Gati, I think that at least in some of the, there is somewhat more fertile terrain right in your near abroad, where the European, Western European and Central European examples could be very helpful. So I think you have a right, and maybe even, as one of the speakers said this morning, a responsibility to help nurture democracy in your near abroad, and maybe also in Burma, or a few other countries where there is some really, where are some leaders who desire the help. We shouldn't force the model. You shouldn't force the model on anybody, just as Americans should not force their model on anybody. But there is a demand, and you have some wonderful examples to show. So I would strongly encourage you Europeans, to be active in the sense of being responsive, not forcing anything on anybody, but when there is a demand, then help people figure out how to make democracy work.
Thank you very, very much. I have promised, 5 minutes to 5. We have 4:53, so just 1 minute to conclusion. It reminds me about more than 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, there was a Secretary of State in Washington called Madeleine Albright, and has brought an initiative. I hope that you remember communities of democracies. The idea that democracies will cooperate mostly at the UN framework together and will constitute a majority because most of the states are democracies. When this came to Europe, it reached the table of the French foreign minister, who was called Hubert Védrine, and he said clearly it will not work. Democracy is not like instant coffee, that would be worked out in a minute in a glass of water. And the Czechs were caught, in somewhere in between. On one hand, they like this American freedom promotion, American way of idealism, because always when this idealism has prevailed, we were benefiting from this. In 1918, 1945, 1989, in all crucial moments. So we are somehow the fan of that. At the same time, living in the middle of Europe, we also share some skepticism about and have this a taste of realism. And here we are. Please continue in your mission. Thanks for coming to Prague. We will always be here to listen your preaches, voices, advices. Of course, then, once you come back home, you will see this classic Czech realistic work, so that's life. Thank you very, very much.